Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whichever time it is for you. My name is Rithvik Guntor, and today we will be discussing the MVC design pattern within the field of software engineering. We will dive into what exactly is MVC, its components, why it is important, and its applications in this broad world of software. I'm truly excited about the information that we're going to explore together. So without further ado, let us get started. First and foremost, we must understand what design patterns are before we dive straight into MVC. Design patterns are essentially reusable techniques and solutions for designing software. They are found throughout the industry across many forms of software, like websites, video games, and mobile applications. Additionally, there are several design patterns, with each having their own strengths and weaknesses depending on the problem at hand. The one we will be looking into today is the MVC, which is one of the most used and common design patterns. The MVC design pattern is the separation of an application into three components: the model, the view, and the controller, each with their own designated role. It is one of the many design patterns used throughout the industry for various pieces of software. It can be seen in use cases like web applications, mobile applications, and even video games. The MVC provides a structured foundation and framework for writing complex software with high volume code. The separation of these components promotes simplicity with development, testing, and maintenance. The model component of an MVC structured piece of software provides the backbone for the application. One could think of the model component like the back-end portion of an application. The model contains the business logic and encapsulated data that is communicated through the application. Here we can see data manipulation, processing, and storage. The model plays an important role in various applications like updating user accounts, managing financial transactions, and many more as well. This component is unique in the sense that it is independent of the view and controller components, which will be further explored in the upcoming slides. The view component of an MVC application essentially acts as the front end of the application. It represents the user interface, which is what the user of the application directly interacts with, without knowing what really happens under the hood. Its primary function is to display the data from the model component in a clean, organized, and interactive manner for the customer to use for their needs and liking. Examples of the view component include web pages and mobile application screens. The view contains the code to create a visual representation of the data being manipulated and gives the software a much more tangible feel. For instance, on many websites, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code would contain the logic to implement the user interface for a customer. This would ultimately represent the view for the software. This component is ultimately more centric around the visuals and presentation of information, as opposed to data processing, storage, and logic, which are components that are more tied to the backend or model. The controller component of the MVC serves as arguably the most important component, as it is what connects the model and the view. Typically, a piece of software requires some sort of communication between the front-end and back-end components. This is where the controller comes into picture. Essentially, it takes in user input, like a mouse click, for instance, and processes it. It then interacts with the model and view to achieve the desired actions and behavior for the application. The controller typically contains logic pertaining to the overall state and flow of the application. When it comes to clicking a button or even making an API request, the controller is responsible for capturing the behavior of the model and transforming it into a meaningful visual representation in the view. Take a moment to pause and think about some real-world examples that are related to the model, view, controller design pattern. This design has many real-world applications and situations that are relevant to this type of design. For now, pause and think about this, and we will discuss some examples in a few moments. Alright, hopefully you have had some time to think about real-world examples of the model view controller design. One example that immediately comes to mind is the world of robotics. These are complex yet fascinating systems that can be designed in many different ways. In the context of MVC, the model would represent the underlying data and logic of the robot software. This would essentially encapsulate the state of the robot along with several functionality features, like sensors and actuators. The algorithms behind the robotic system's functionality would be hidden from those who are directly interacting with the robot, but would ultimately dictate the system's underlying behavior. The view component is interesting because it would not be a graphical user interface in this scenario, but the robot itself. The user who would be interacting with the robotic system would interact with the robot itself without knowing how it is being operated under the hood. The controller component for a system like this would be responsible for dictating the system's overall behavior, like inputting data or commands that tell the robot what to do. This component would connect the model and view components by translating input into actions for the system. The model view controller comes with various advantages for its use in software solutions, but not without its disadvantages as well. It shortens development time depending on the project at hand, in addition to providing an organized approach to the overall software development. It also encourages simpler collaboration practices with clearly defined roles for each component of the MVC. The MVC would simplify task distribution for testing and debugging as well. Applications that have multiple model, view, and controller components would allow for more code reusability, thus improving development time and potentially its scalability as well. Some of the downsides of the MVC design include potentially having trouble understanding the design architecture, more specifically how the three components work together to construct an application, especially for those new to software development. The model, view, and controller will each have their own set of constraints for their methods. For instance, certain parts of the model will have to be encapsulated to prevent issues with data and logic. Certain applications will be more complicated with several models, views, and controllers, which may make the communication between various components complicated and confusing. Therefore, it won't be suitable for all variations of software applications. As we have discussed, the MVC is a cutting-edge design technique used by many developers and teams. The design pattern's emphasis on separating an application into three components allows it to simplify development, testing, and maintenance, and enhance scalability as well. Many of us have likely utilized MVC structured software and applications before unknowingly. Now that we know what model view controller is, there is the potential for us to potentially develop more of our own as well in the near future. Before we wrap up, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.